Hey everyone. So this channel may be about gaming, but I'm not just a fan of video games. I'm also a huge fan of the tabletop gaming space. You know, board games, card games, and especially tabletop RPGs. You know the like, Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, Lancer, Wrath and Glory. I've played lots of them over the years, but there is one problem that often gets brought up in a lot of these games, with some having it a lot worse than others, and that is of course the martial caster divide. Essentially, it's the idea that player characters with access to magic, or whatever equivalent there is in a particular game, tend to be a lot more powerful and versatile than characters that don't use magic, such as your classic fighters and barbarians. This problem mostly originates from classic Dungeons & Dragons, where it was actually an intentional design choice way back in the days of advanced Dungeons & Dragons and the like. The idea was that magical characters like wizards would actually start off absurdly weak, and they would even level up slower than other characters. So if you had, say, a level 10 fighter in your group, your wizard who has gone through all of the same trials and tribulations might only be, say, level 8 or even less. But over time, as modern game design principles took over, things tended to even out a little bit and casters were given a little bit more support early on, especially since lots of people playing a spellcaster wanted to, unsurprisingly, cast spells, not do things like shoot a crossbow for most of their adventuring days. But casters still grew exponentially more powerful as they got higher in levels, while non-casters rarely got such boons. But this issue at the end of the day is a little bit more complicated than just saying that casters are too strong. So what I want to do today is bring to the table all of the various reasons that I can think of that lead to the current problem of why magic users tend to be so powerful compared to martial characters, starting with the most obvious issues and working my way down to some more subtle problems that you may not necessarily think about at first. This problem is particularly evident in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, which will be the main focus of this video, but a lot of these same criticisms exist across numerous other kinds of tabletop RPGs. Not to mention that, thanks to some recent events, a lot of companies have started making their own custom offshoots of 5e, such as Kobold Press's Black Flag system. I believe Critical Role recently announced that they're releasing their own line of RPGs, and of course, Wizards of the Coast themselves are essentially making a 5.5 edition to update and address some of the issues with 5th edition themselves. So, a lot of companies are sort of dipping their toes into the 5th edition remake ring. But even if you're making your own wholly original RPG, I think that you may want to take some of these martial and caster disparity issues into account. But before I get into the issues themselves, I just want to clarify that this video is purely about trying to identify and diagnose the problem, not to solve it outright. I may make a comment here or there about some change that I would make, but that is not the focus of this video. But if you like what you see and you want to see me expand on this idea and talk about what I think should be done to solve these issues, then maybe consider subscribing and turning on notifications so that you can be aware of when I post more videos like this one. So without much further ado, I think that the first and most often cited source of the problem is of course the issue of raw damage potential. But I think that even this is more complicated than it may seem at first glance, since most people simply state that casters just deal more damage than martial characters do, and leave it at that. But in actuality, in 5th edition's Dungeons & Dragons at least, martial characters can actually put out a pretty decent amount of damage. If we just do some quick math real quick, a basic fighter equipped with just a greatsword and say the Great Weapon Master feat can do a whopping 2d6 plus their strength modifier of 5 plus 10 damage per attack and have 4 attacks per round, which is about 80 or so damage on average. On top of that, they could action surge to effectively double that to over 160 damage. And even if we compare that to, say, a level 9 spell like Meteor Swarm, which does a whopping 40 d6 of damage, well, that's only about 140 damage. So the fighter can actually deal slightly more damage. However, you might realize a key difference in the example, and that is the fact that Meteor Swarm unleashes 4 massive meteors that have a radius of I think 40 feet that can hit all of the enemies within that space for the same amount of damage. Meanwhile, if the fighter wants to hit multiple enemies, they have to divide up their attacks across different enemies, and as a result, reduce the amount of damage that they do to any one enemy. So really, the core of the problem with the damage potential difference between martial characters and casters is that casters have access to area of effect spells, and that is simply something that I think is too powerful to only be available to a certain type of character. If instead of fighting a single really big enemy with a lot of health, you instead put the fighter and the wizard up against, say, 100 goblins, even if the fighter can kill a goblin in a single strike, they can only kill as many goblins as they have attacks in each turn. Meanwhile, even if you put a significantly lower level wizard, like say just a simple 5th level caster that just has access to Fireball in that scenario, they would be able to kill dozens of goblins every single turn with ease. And on top of that, a lot of area of effect spells have effectively guaranteed damage. Sure, there's like legendary resistances and elemental resistances and whatnot, but generally speaking, when you cast a fireball, even if the enemy does everything right and passes their saving throw, you still get half damage, which means damage is guaranteed upon spending that spell slot. Meanwhile, if a fighter misses their attack, well, then it just kind of sucks to suck, and they just don't get anything out of it. So the real issue with the damage potential difference between martials and casters is that a caster can effectively scale their damage output to the size of an encounter. A fireball does the same amount of damage whether you're hitting one enemy with it, 5 enemies with it, or dozens of enemies with it, which means that if an encounter has a ton of enemies in it, a wizard is just as useful as they are if there's only one enemy in it. Meanwhile, a fighter gets dramatically less useful the more enemies that they're fighting at the same time, because they simply don't have the capabilities to deal with as many enemies at once. But of course, damage isn't the end-all be-all of every encounter. Spellcasters are notably limited by the amount of spell slots that they have in a day, meaning that even if they want to cast something powerful like, say, that aforementioned Meteor Swarm, which can do a ton of damage to a ton of enemies, well, that's a 9th level spell, which means they only get a single one of those across an entire adventuring day, which means that once they cast it, it's gone and they can't cast it again until they take a long rest. Meanwhile, characters like the fighter and other martial characters like them are designed to operate on much fewer resources per day, and thus are able to last much longer throughout the adventuring day. Or at least that's how it's meant to work on paper. First things first, it's important to recognize that martial characters, even if they have fewer resources that they rely on than casters, they do still have some resources, and quite possibly the most important one of all is health. Because if you run out of health, well, you can't exactly use any other resources or abilities now, can you? And well, the thing about martial characters is that they're often meant to be the front line of a party, which means that they're the ones that are sacrificing their health the most. So even if they don't necessarily have any abilities that run on a limited number of resources throughout the day, they still have to worry about managing their health. And if they're the ones taking the brunt of the damage, well, at the end of the day, they might not be alive to see the end of the day, which kinda puts a damper on their ability to last longer than casters do throughout an adventuring day. Sure, martial characters tend to have slightly more health than casters, but I honestly don't think that the difference is really enough to really make it feel like that a martial character can surely last that much longer, especially when they're the one taking most of the damage. But of course, there is still an issue with the magical side of that equation as well. You see, the problem with designing a class around the idea that it has a limited number of resources that it can use per day is that its power level, in turn, depends dramatically upon how often they have to use those resources. In Dungeons & Dragons specifically, the game is typically designed around encountering about half a dozen encounters in a single adventuring day. But what that means is that if you have an adventuring day where you experience, say, fewer encounters than that, well then they're gonna have a lot more resources in order to, say, cast way more powerful spells across those fewer encounters, and end up not being punished for using up all their resources. And conversely, in theory, if you ran way more than half a dozen encounters in a single day, well then the casters would run out of spells way before the end of the day, and they might be completely useless in some of the later fights. The problem, of course, is that in my experience, and in the experience of watching a lot of other people play tabletop games, is that they tend to not run that many encounters in a day. Most campaigns that I've seen, especially homebrew campaigns, tend to be a lot more about overland travel, visiting various cities and landmarks, and spending days traveling between them, rather than literal dungeon crawling. And as a result, if, say, a party is taking about 4 days to travel from one location to another, it can be fairly unreasonable to expect that they would get into something like 24 different encounters across those 4 days of travel. So as a result, most DMs reasonably simplify things down to only maybe a couple of encounters a day, if that. But as a result, when you have so few encounters in a day, that means that the casters are able to spend all of their most powerful resources right off the bat, and then pretty much immediately take a long rest and recover all of those resources without any kind of consequence. And this has a fairly dramatic effect on the game's balance, because even if martial characters are able to outlast casters by a significant margin, they simply rarely get the chance to do so when you're having so few encounters in a day. Now, the issue of power level and resource management are easily the most often brought up issues in this discussion. So let's now move on to some slightly less often brought up issues that still get brought up sometimes, but not quite as often as the things I've said so far. Starting, of course, with the raw versatility of spellcasters. In 5th edition, regardless of things like class boundaries, there are effectively 4 basic roles that most classes fit into. Some may specialize in only one, or may dip their toes across multiple, and of course there are ways that you could subdivide these roles even further, but generally speaking, these are the 4 basic roles that most classes fit into. You have, of course, damage, your basic ability to hurt your opponents to actually win the fight. You know, things like casting Fireball to take out a group of goblins, as I mentioned earlier. You have your controllers, people who can manipulate the battlefield to your advantage. So, for instance, things like Fog Cloud to limit enemy vision, Wall of Fire to limit enemy movement, or even simple buff and debuff effects like Bane and Bless. You have damage mitigation, which is kind of a catch-all term for both healing and tanking, because at the end of the day, the goal of both of these concepts is to reduce the amount of damage the party is taking. So things like protection from elements, cure wounds, or even something as simple as using a shield. And then of course you have utility, which typically covers things like out-of-combat usefulness, things like using Mage Hand to reach an object that you can't physically reach, or teleporting the party across distances so that they don't have to make the travel on foot. Now, if you were paying attention, you may have noticed a trend with all of my examples, and that was that I was using spells as examples for how to cover every category. And not only that, but these are all effects that a single spellcaster, such as a cleric or a wizard, could all manage to accomplish entirely on their own. You see, most classes, like fighters and rogues, can only really be good at maybe 1 or 2 of these categories, sacrificing their ability to perform in others. But wizards and other spellcasters can often be good at all 4 of these categories fairly easily due to the simply wide variety of spells that they have access to. And in fact, most martial characters can only really slot themselves into either the damage and or the damage mitigation categories. And I've already gone over why martial characters suffer on the damage front. They can't really get into the control side of things because usually the best that they can do is grapple enemies, and you can only really grapple a single enemy at a time. And in terms of utility, while a martial character could provide some utility, such as how a rogue can disarm traps and scout ahead with stealth and whatnot, generally speaking, the utility that they can provide is vastly overshadowed by the simple versatility that spells provide, such as with invisibility or telekinesis or teleportation and so on. Now, to be fair, not every spellcasting class has access to every spell. They've already talked about how in 5.5, for example, bards can only pick from divination, enchantment, illusion, or transmutation spells, which significantly limits their capabilities compared to, say, a wizard. But in my opinion, I've always kind of felt like all spellcasting classes should really have to interact with the spell school system. It feels kinda weird to me that you can be an illusionist subclass wizard that specializes in illusion magic, and yet there's nothing stopping you from, say, picking fireball and protection from energy in order to also still be good at dealing damage and negating damage on top of the various mind games that you can play with your illusion spells. But even if we narrowed down spellcasters to mostly focusing on the control side of things, there is still the matter of just how powerful it is that spellcasters have a much greater access to manipulate the action economy of a fight. In general, for anybody who may not be familiar with the term, action economy effectively refers to how many turns each side of a conflict can take. If, for example, you're fighting a single big bad evil guy with 5 adventurers, that means that the adventurers are getting 5 times as many turns as the main antagonist, because he can only go once for every 5 turns that the players get. This is actually the reason why things like legendary actions exist, because the sheer advantage that you get by having so many more turns than your opponent is that significant that in order to make a single enemy an actual threat for an adventuring party, they literally need to give them extra turns in order to be able to act during and in between the opponent's turns. And of course, the players have means of manipulating this action economy. Though of course, by players, I mostly mean spellcasters. For example, haste and slow are probably the most overt examples of how casters can manipulate action economy, because those spells' main effect are literally to give a person either more or fewer actions. But on top of that, they also have a lot of other spells that can at least hinder an opponent's action economy, such as Web, one of my favorite ways to open up a combat. Web restricts an opponent's movement and restrains them to the ground. And then on top of that, in order to escape the web, they have to waste their action for the turn trying to yank themselves free. Which means that even if they pass that check in order to get free of the webbing, they still can't actually attack you on that same turn. And if they choose not to break free of the webbing, well then they still are unable to use their movement part of their action, and they're unable to attack as effectively due to the debuff from being restrained. And as is the trend with most of these topics, there's not really any equivalents for what martial characters are capable of. Sure, fighters can action surge to give themselves effectively an extra turn, and rogues have some interesting abilities that they can use as a bonus action to kind of give them a little bit more actions in a single turn. But even something as simple as Web not only can effectively delete an entire enemy's turn in a combat, but it's also an AoE effect, which means that it could affect multiple enemy turns all at once. And on top of that, it could potentially last for multiple turns for the cost of a single action on the wizard's part. So yeah, everything I've said up to now is already making martials look like they're in a pretty dire situation compared to casters. But there are still more things that I think are even more subtle and rarely get brought up in these discussions that I think are just as important as everything I've said up till now. For one, there is the issue of just how many options a character has to spend their action on. Now, this isn't quite the same as the versatility issue that I brought up before, as this is more specifically about the actual number of different things that the character can choose to do on their turn. For example, if a martial character wants to do something on their turn without spending any resources, generally speaking, their options are very limited. Usually it pretty much just boils down to the martial character running up to the enemy and hitting it with their sword, or if they're an archer, shooting them with their bow. there's usually not many other things that they can do on their turn. They could maybe do a grapple, but that usually requires doing a specific build, and they can do things like shove, but the effect of that option is usually so minor that most people would prefer to just do a basic attack instead. And as a result, the vast majority of the time, whenever the martial character doesn't have any other resources to spend, they end up just spending their turn doing the same thing over and over again, which is just to run up and attack an enemy. Meanwhile, if we look at the magical side of this equation, even if we assume a spellcaster that is completely out of spell slots, just the mere presence of cantrips typically provides them with a more interesting amount of options than a martial character typically has access to. Most magical characters get multiple cantrips that they can choose from in a turn, and each cantrip typically has not only different ranges, but also different damage types and different secondary effects that can be applied along with them. Meaning that a magical character who is completely out of resources can still decide, oh, maybe I want to use Shocking Grasp because it'll give me advantage, or maybe I'd rather back up and use a spell like Frostbite in order to slow my enemy down so they can't reach me. Meanwhile, all that the martial character can do is deal damage and rarely get any kind of secondary effect out of it. And even if we expand our scope beyond just the turn-by-turn actions, in general, spellcasters just get so many more class features than martial characters do. A single level 1 wizard gets to choose between 3 cantrips and 6 first level spells just at first level, and the things that they get to choose from literally is a spell list with over 100 different options. Meanwhile, at first level, all a fighter gets to choose is what weapon they want to wield, and I guess what fighting style they get, and there's only about half a dozen of those to choose from. Even if we go up a few levels, a level 3 Battlemaster fighter, arguably one of the most complex fighters you can play in 5th edition, only gets to pick a grand total of 3 combat maneuvers out of around 20 or so options. Meanwhile, a wizard will have gotten to choose 4 more spells across hundreds more options just from the spellcasting side of their class. Now sure, I'm not saying that fighters and barbarians need to be as complicated as a wizard, but the sheer gap in the number of options available to the most complex martial character and the least complex spellcaster is frankly astonishing at this point. Although, even if we're only talking about the kinds of features that are available to both martials and spellcasters, such as feats, there's still a significant disparity between the two even there. Specifically, I'm talking about half feats, feats that give you a stat bonus as well as an interesting ability. You see, in 5th edition, most builds are based around how you get your primary stat to 20, which is the highest you can raise a stat in that game. And feats are really the only main way that you can raise your stats. Now, you can spend an entire feat just raising your stats by 2, which is a good way to get to 20 very quickly, but a much more fun and interesting way to get to 20 is via half feats, because getting new and interesting abilities is often a lot more fun than just simply making a number go up. And half feats quite literally let you split the difference between both extremes, letting you gain both an interesting ability as well as raise your stat to work it towards 20. However, to put it simply, there are just so many more half-feats that are focused around mental stats than there are physical stats. And of course, mental stats are primarily used by spellcasters, while physical stats are used by martial characters. There's Fey Touch, Shadow Touch, Telepathic, Telekinetic. There are so many various magical-oriented feats, or just feats in general, that allow you to boost your mental stats. Whereas there are much fewer feats that actually boost physical stats. And even then, most of the feats that boost physical stats are more limited. They only let you boost 1 or 2 physical stats, rather than letting you choose from all 3, like Fey Touched does. And on top of that, they also tend to be a lot more niche for specific builds. For example, Tavern Brawler lets you boost either Strength or Constitution. But unless you're building an improvised weapon-based character, you don't really have much of a reason to use it. Similarly, there's a feat for each of the main basic damage types, with Crusher, Piercer, and Slasher, But again, you're probably only going to be able to benefit from one of those feats based on what your primary weapon of choice is, and then you won't really have a reason to pick any of the others. And even then, those feats only let you boost one or two stats at most, rather than giving you a choice between all three physical stats. So what this all amounts to is feats, something that you think would be fairly unbiased since most classes can take most feats since there are very few prerequisites in 5th edition. They still end up being heavily biased towards spellcasters because there simply are more feats that better cater to what spellcasters would want than feats that cater to martial characters. Finally, the last big reason why martial characters tend to be at such a disadvantage compared to casters is kind of more of a meta reason relating to how new content tends to be delivered for the game. You see, magical characters all use the same spellcasting system. They all cast spells. They may use different spells between them, but the spellcasting system is a universal system that is shared between all these different magical classes. Meanwhile, martial characters, even when they have similar kinds of abilities, like the Battlemaster's maneuvers or the Rune Knight's various runes that they can use, those are all specific, disparate systems that are unique to those classes and subclasses. Whereas the spellcasting system is something that is very easy to expand upon. So what ends up happening when a new book comes out is new books almost always include new spells for spellcasters to use, because it's very trivial to just add a new spell, label which casters can take it, and then call it a day. But it's a lot harder to add things like combat maneuvers or runes for the Rune Knight, or anything like that, because those are very specific to that subclass. So it's very rare that you would expect a book to print new features that can only be used by a single subclass for a single class, as opposed to printing a spell which they could easily have be usable by a majority of the classes in the game. And as a result, spellcasters only continue to increase the arsenal of spells at their disposal the more content that gets released for the system. And this can only result in the spellcasters getting more powerful, because if a new spell gets released and it's weaker than current spells, well, then they're just back to square one and they just won't use it. But if a new spell gets released that's more powerful than current spells, like infamously when Silvery Barbs was released, and suddenly all the spellcasters had access to the spell that let them impose disadvantage on people, well, suddenly all the spellcasters with access to that spell got a big jump in power. Meanwhile, as usual, martial characters get left behind in the dust, because even as new books get printed, they almost never print new content for the various martial subclasses that could be easily expanded upon, and as a result, those subclasses, which seem like good ways to make martials more interesting, just kinda get left as they are when they were first written, without ever being expanded upon or updated in any meaningful capacity. And so, the martials end up continuing to be stagnant forever, while the magical characters get to continually increase what spells they have access to again and again. And so, that basically brings an end to all of the general complaints that I can think of for why martial characters struggle to keep up with magical characters. Although, we're still not quite done yet, because I do have a few more points to make specifically about melee characters, even in comparison to ranged characters. While both are at a significant disadvantage compared to magical characters, I believe that melee characters are at even more of a disadvantage compared to their ranged brethren. To quickly go over what I'm talking about, the first point I want to make is about movement. All characters can move on their turn, of course. However, melee characters require their movement a lot more than everyone else, because you see, you can't exactly stab somebody with your sword if you're standing 30 feet away from them. So as a result, they're often forced to use their movement to close in the distance to their enemies, just so that they can actually use their character to attack people. Meanwhile, ranged characters, whether they're just an archer or a spellcaster, are able to use their movement a lot more tactically. They could attack from a distance and then use their movement to move further away so that the enemy melee characters can't catch up to them. They could also simply move behind cover, which in general is just something that melee characters can't really take advantage of, and yet ranged characters and spellcasters are able to use it to further boost their AC in various circumstances. And finally, there's just the general difference in the quality of the main stat that a melee character uses compared to a ranged character, mainly the difference between strength and dexterity. Strength is frankly a kind of underpowered stat. It's useful for wearing heavy armor, of course, and you deal more damage with melee weapons, and that's mostly it. Yes, it boosts your carrying capacity, but carrying capacity in 5th edition specifically is very high, and even if we're not talking about 5th edition specifically, a lot of systems have items like bags of holding or various other ways to carry a lot of stuff, even if you don't have a very high strength. And on top of that, saving throws for strength are few and far between. Frankly, I feel like there should be a lot more of them, but nonetheless, they're a lot less common, especially compared to dexterity saving throws, which are arguably among the most common of saving throws, since a ton of AoE spells call for dex saves. On top of that, dexterity also boosts your AC, your initiative, and it can also be used for both ranged and melee combat. It's primarily used for ranged combat, of course, but you can also be pretty good at melee combat by picking up a rapier and then just using it with your dexterity. And the closest that strength-based characters can get to that versatility is that they can use ranged weapons via thrown weapons as using their strength, but thrown weapons have a lot shorter range compared to most other ranged weapons, whereas the only downside to a dexterity-based character using a finesse melee weapon is that it does slightly less damage than a normal one-handed melee weapon would. Add on top of that, dexterity just is used for a lot more useful skills than strength is. All strength really gets to itself is athletics. There's no social skills or anything useful like that tied to strength. Although I do think a lot of people homebrew that you can intimidate people with strength instead of charisma, which I think is a very good homebrew. But regardless, by default, all they get is athletics, which is pretty much just a basic application of force. Meanwhile, dexterity gets acrobatics, which in a lot of cases can be used in place of athletics, and can also be used to navigate difficult environments. Sleight of hand has a number of useful purposes, ranging from disabling traps to pickpocketing people, and stealth is used by pretty much everyone, even if you're not the dedicated party scout. And of course, if you have a good stealth check, then you can fulfill that role for your party. And so, that finally brings an end to the full list of just about everything that I can personally think of for why martial characters struggle to keep up with magical characters. I wish I could say that this video ended up being a lot longer than I thought it would be, but frankly, there's a lot of reasons and a lot of things that need to be addressed in any kind of update to any RPG really that wishes to address this problem. However, if you can think of any issues that I may have missed, or if you want to expand on anything I talked about, feel free to continue the conversation down in the comments. I'll be looking forwards to when the 5.5 playtest packet that finally lets us know what they're changing about martial characters comes out. And if you like this video and want to see me review potential systems like 5.5 or Black Flag and the others, and talk about how they do or don't address the various issues that I brought up, feel free to let me know by hitting that subscribe button. Until next time, thanks for watching.